Welcome to the fifth and final video in this series, critiquing the sample research prospectus that I wrote. So we're on this section of the paper focusing on the large-scale research project, discussing the methods, and what I'm doing in this section again is I begin by making this sort of transition to connect the prior content pertaining to the small-scale project or the pilot to this new content. So I'm indicating here, I propose furthering the research by doing these semi-structured interviews with food bank staff and food bank clients at several universities throughout the United States, and then I identify the universities that I would want to focus on. So what you'll see in this section is that I would use the same interview questions for the food bank staff, just making adjustments as appropriate, instead of focusing on University of Mississippi in some cases, obviously putting in the actual university name for these other schools. However, something that is new is conducting those interviews with food bank clients, and so that will be Appendix C of this paper, will be the interview questions I would use for the food bank clients. Of course, expanding my sample beyond just the University of Mississippi to include these other schools. So I indicate why I chose these universities. According to the College and University Food Bank Alliance website, all of these schools are members, the exception being University of Mississippi, but then I explain why it is I would continue to work with the University of Mississippi for the large-scale project, because I would want to really further the data I collected already in the small-scale pilot. Now, as I'm indicating here, I give some more justification for why I chose these schools. So not only because they're members of CUFBA, but also because of these other factors. So they're located in different parts of the country, so I'm able to account for potential geographic factors. They have large student populations, with the exception of University of California, this branch campus. And then also these schools are located in urban as well as rural areas. So as I explained, being able to compare these schools from these different regions that are located in these different settings can allow me to account for certain variables pertaining to geography and demographics that I otherwise may not be able to do. And then also the fact that the majority of the schools have this substantial student enrollment means that I probably have greater likelihood of recruiting the participants that I would need, because I have a larger group of people to work with. And then finally, I indicate the other reasons for choosing these schools are that none of the prior studies have looked at these particular institutions, so I'd be contributing some new case studies to the research. And then also, I haven't been finding studies that have done this comparison of schools, so collecting data from multiple institutions and then comparing that data within a single article. I haven't seen that, so that's another value of the research. Now again, I include some information just like I did for the small scale project about going through IRB training. And then one thing that's definitely different here is how I would solicit participation, because I would have to first of all find out who the director and faculty sponsor or faculty sponsor is for each of the food banks, and how I would locate that information, depending on whether or not there's a website for the food bank, or if I would have to just use an online directory for the school. And presumably all of these schools would have an online directory given their size. Again, the branch campus of the University of California being a possible exception. I explained that I would use email, and then I would follow up with a phone call. And, that's one thing you have to consider whenever you're discussing how you would solicit participation. Would you do so by going to make a face-to-face request if that were feasible? Would you do so by phone? Would you do so by email? I choose email here just because, with email, the person will read it whenever he or she has the time to do that, whenever it's convenient, versus if I were to just call that person up, I may interrupt them from something, and if I caught them at a really bad time, that may in some way impact how they would view the study when I discussed on that initial contact. So I just personally would prefer to contact by email, but then I would rely on a phone call within this 2-week window, just to ensure they had actually received my request if I hadn't heard back from them, to give them further information if that would be useful in them making their decision whether or not to participate, etc. I explained that recruitment could take 1 to 3 months, depending on various factors. This seems like a fairly reasonable estimate. However, at the same time, recruitment could take even longer, just depending on any particular procedures that that institution may have for participating in interinstitutional research. I then go on to explain that once I had the sites of participation confirmed, then I would really need to arrange the dates for going to those particular sites in order to gather my data. So also I would need to make arrangements to actually train some of the food bank staff to conduct interviews with food bank clients as part of my data collection, and I'll get to explain that soon. So again, I mentioned I would use semi-structured interviews, and I'm referring the reader to the questions found in Appendix A, because using those same questions for the food bank staff would allow me to actually compare that data across the schools. And then I'm going on here to explain why it is I would train food bank staff at the participating schools to collect the interview data from clients rather than me trying to do it all myself in this large-scale study. So given that these schools are all throughout the United States, and if I were to try and collect this data on my own, that would add substantially to the amount of time as well as the funding needed to complete this project, that it actually would be more efficient to train food bank staff. In addition, presumably food bank clients wouldn't be that willing to let a total stranger, someone not even affiliated with their university, interview them about something that can be incredibly personal. So relying on food bank staff may help to ensure participation as well as the accuracy of that participation. So again, justify any potential design decisions you're making that the reader may question or that you feel you really need to kind of elaborate on or explain. Here I give an estimate of how many people I would want to collect my data from, and then I do explain that for the University of Mississippi, when it comes to interviewing the food bank clients, I would just do that myself given that I would have access, or I may work with a staff member, but I wouldn't have the same need to rely on others for data collection as I would at the schools outside of the University of Mississippi. So here I'm explaining sort of the timeline, anticipating it taking up to a month for the interviews with food bank staff and training of the staff members who would be conducting interviews. I explained that I would conduct the interviews with the food bank staff by phone or by Skype, and that would be more efficient in terms of time and monetary resources. I explained I would anticipate at least a week spent to train the staff members, although really it probably would take more time than that, so I could be more conservative here just to strengthen this section. And then here I'm referring the reader to Appendix C to find the actual interview questions I would ask the food bank clients. And I'm not going to skip down to that just because I've already shown you two appendices at this point, and going through the sample paper you'll see this appendix, and it follows really closely the format of the other two appendices. I indicate what the training would entail because that's really important. Again, you're trying to be as specific and detailed as you possibly can be. And then when we get into this next paragraph, I'm talking about, again, my timeline, how long I anticipate it may take to collect the interview data from the food bank clients. And then what the, sorry, that skipped ahead a little bit, what the actual approach would be in terms of trying to record the interviews if there were permission to do so from the interviewee, how I would secure appropriate interview conditions, because I would have to ask the director and a faculty sponsor for help with this. And then also indicating that I would check in with each food bank, so they would be collecting this interview data for me from the food bank clients, but it would be really important to check in with them fairly regularly, and I indicate every 2 weeks, because you don't want, if you are going to rely on others to contribute to your data collection, you don't want it to seem like you're making them do all of the work and that you've become really disconnected from your project and from them. So it would be important to regularly check in. And then I explained that I would generally plan to just do these check-ins by phone or possibly online using programs such as Skype. However, at least once I would travel to the school, and I think that's important to have that face-to-face connection, especially if the project may last up to 6 months or potentially even longer. Here I explain how long I anticipate the interviews would last with each food bank client, and again I give the topics of the questions rather than embedding all of the questions in the content of the paper. And if you remember from before, I told you another option is to discuss or to give some of the sample questions you would ask, or you could give that information in addition to saying, here are the kinds of questions I would ask, for example. So if you have a lot of questions, it's better to include an appendix. And again, use your best judgment as far as organizationally what works well. And during peer review, your classmate who you're assigned to work with should be able to tell you whether organizationally that list of questions, if you're proposing a survey or interview, is effective to include in the content of the paper or to move out into an appendix. Now the last paragraph of this section is basically my budget, breaking down how much money I estimate I would need and for what kind of expense that money would be needed for. Now I do, as I indicated in the comment bubble here, this can seem as though I end this section fairly abruptly, and so maybe if I had another paragraph in here or I restructured this information so I didn't necessarily end on this, that could make this section a stronger ending to the discussion of the large-scale research. So again, remember, as I had explained in a previous video, the goal of giving you this sample paper isn't to give you a perfect paper. The idea is to point out for you some things that you want to do to ensure that the paper is effective, and also highlight for you some of the things that I see students in the past have done that made the paper a little bit weaker. And so by including these sorts of things and calling your attention to them, hopefully that'll help you to avoid those issues in your own writing. Now, after the large-scale section, we do get the conclusion, which is also labeled. Remember, the conclusion should start off by essentially restatement or summary of your main point or your thesis, but then it needs to go beyond. It shouldn't only be summary information. So what I'm doing about midway through or so, I introduce new content as far as proposing another way or something else that we could be investigating in future research. So really two options, as your textbook tells you, for how to add new content into your conclusion. Two things that work really well would be suggestions, specific suggestions for further research going forward, and or to identify a new value or significance of the research that you have done. So with this paper, some of you may find it easier for you to focus on a new significance or value, since this paper is a proposal of research. However, it can work to identify yet another way to do the research or something else to look at for research, and that's what I've done here. I mentioned that instead of only looking at food banks, maybe we need to look at other options that have been presented as a way to respond to food insecurity. And one of those options is on-campus gardens, because there's one article, and I can't remember now which one it was, that I had looked at that mentioned gardens as a way of responding to food insecurity. And that was the only article I looked at that did that. So that could be a fruitful area for further research. And then the paper just wraps up on page 15. Remember that your conclusion doesn't really need to be long and drawn out. You're looking at, I think the guideline was half page to at max about a page. And then of course after the conclusion we get the references page, and I'm not going to go through that because I've already covered APA style in earlier videos. And then just finally remember that after the references, that's where we would get the appendix. And if you have more than one appendix, you do need to label it. So Appendix A, Appendix B, Appendix C, and so on. I hope that this series of videos and this sample prospectus that I wrote for you have been really useful resources to help you in your planning. Of course, earlier in the week I had provided you with that student-written sample, and remember that that sample is very similar to what you were being asked to do. The major difference being that the student actually did conduct that small-scale research, and of course the actual titles of the sections were a little bit different, but the only major content issue that was different than what you were being asked to do was that she actually could report on what she had done and the data she had collected and the analysis of the data. And for you in your paper, you're not actually doing any data collection, you're just indicating what you would do. So I hope that that sample prospectus was also useful to you, especially because I wasn't able to get my paper into the site as early as I'd hoped. This week was just a little bit of an off week as far as some personal things. That my daughter had been sick earlier in the week, and then she again had, I think, a bit of a stomach bug this weekend. And then, I've just been trying to get this paper done, and it's obviously a very long paper, especially with the appendices. So it just took me a bit of time. And then I also was catching up on grading. So I try to get these resources into the site as quickly as I could for you, but I also wanted to give you a really good sample paper, and so that explains the delay. Again, though, I hope this was useful, and please do let me know if you have any questions or concerns about the sample paper and or the critique videos that I have prepared for you.